So, on behalf of the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies and the Labor Solidarity Project at the University of Washington, Tacoma, I'd like to welcome everybody back to our fall seminar series, Educate, Agitate, Organize. My name is Alex Miller, and I'm an associate teaching professor here at UW-T, where I teach labor studies, American studies, and literature. And I'm really excited about tonight's event, which actually connects in interesting ways with last week's talk on Ben Fletcher, the IWW and multiracial coalition building on Philadelphia's waterfront. This is another event where we're going to be talking about a person whose life, work, and legacy are all kind of like synonymous with the union that they built and their larger vision for economic justice. However, unlike Fletcher and Local 8, Cesar Chavez and the UFW, haven't faded into historical obscurity. In fact, Chavez's legacy, I think, has probably only grown since his death 30 years ago. He's been on a postage stamp. He's got his own federally recognized holiday as of about a decade ago, and a bust of Chavez is currently in the Oval Office. I think, however, despite all of these accolades and this recognition, Chavez is somebody whose legacy is incredibly complex, right? Despite all of the accomplishments, farm work or work in the agricultural industry continues to be among the most like dangerous and exploitative jobs out there. And the system of state-sponsored racial capitalism that makes that industry so profitable continues to this day. So I think that this contrast between Chavez's legacy and kind of the current realities of farm work invites a number of like really interesting questions. How do we make sense of those contradictions? What do we learn from Chavez and then UFW? And then how do we apply those lessons to our own organizing today? So fortunately, our guest tonight is uniquely prepared to help us reconcile some of those contradictions. So joining us to share her work on Chavez, the man, the myth, and the legacy is Miriam Pawel. Powell's an author, a journalist, and an independent historian, the author of several books, most recently, The Browns of California, The Family Dynasty That Transformed a State and Shaped a Nation. I got to remember to pick that book up. I have not read that. But that's a winner of a gold medal in the California Book Awards. It was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize in History. She's also written and reported extensively about agriculture, labor, and social movements, which is kind of why we're here tonight, including two fantastic books that I have read. The Union of Their Dreams, which I was rereading this week, which is absolutely fantastic. Power, Hope, and the Struggle in Cesar Chavez's farm worker movement, and then The Crusades of Cesar Chavez, a biography. And that biography won the 2015 Robert F. Kennedy Book Prize, the California Book Award, and was a National Book Critics Circle Award finalist. All the accolades. Her writing's been supported with fellowships in the National Endowment for the Humanities, California Humanities, and the Alicia Patterson Foundation. So with all that being said, I'd just like to thank Miriam for being here and joining us this evening. I'm just really excited to share this work with our campus, this digital campus, but our local labor community. And just really appreciate the expertise you bring to this topic and the way that your work sort of kind of challenges some of the understandings that a lot of people have about this movement. So we're going to stick to the standard format with a presentation followed by some Q&A. We had a number of fantastic questions submitted by students ahead of time, but feel free as the presentation proceeds to throw questions in the chat as they arise, and we'll kind of work through them in the Q&A. So without further ado, please join me in giving our guest tonight a warm UW-T LSP digital welcome.
Thanks. I've never had a digital welcome like that before. That's very cool. Thank you, Alex. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for that really nice introduction. I'm going to immediately challenge one thing you said, because I actually think, and I'm going to start out my presentation. Well, actually, let me share my screen because I can get this started. Hold on. Let's see if I start. that working?
It looks great.
Okay, cool. Um, so I actually think that most people still in this country by far do not know who Cesar Chavez is. That if people, the people who do know who he is, who have heard of him, who know that Joe Biden has a bust in the White House and all that, um, still have really not much sense of who he is. When my biography came out, there was a movie by Diego Luna. Some people may have even seen it. That came out that was sort of uh, um, a fictionalized account of Chavez's life. And Diego Luna, I did a sort of a stunt to promote it. It premiered at South by Southwest in Austin. And he stood on Cesar Chavez Boulevard and stopped people at random and asked them if they knew who Cesar Chavez was. And people said things like that guy in Venezuela or the boxer. And really, I think to the extent that people have heard of him largely outside of the community that follows labor and organizing, which of course many of you guys are part of, people know he had something to do with farm workers, and that's about all they know. And so that's really kind of why I wrote this book, because, or both books, but in particular wrote the biography, because his accomplishments kind of really deserve to be known. And when I wrote this book in 2014, he had been dead since 1993, and there was no biography of him. And my sort of argument, and one of the reasons that I wanted to do this talk tonight, is that I think the mythology about him that grew up really turned him into a much less interesting character and a less interesting figure. And that was because of the lack of historical scholarship on him. And so I want to talk about Cesar Chavez the man, and I will use this photo because I just think it's a great, very photo that captures him in all of his humanity, versus Cesar Chavez, the very two-dimensional figure on postage stamps. And I suspect that, and maybe we'll get into this conversation later, to the extent that some of you learned about Cesar Chavez in school, what you learned was a fairly two-dimensional version of his story. So, so that's why I wrote the book. The lack of scholarship on him, was not for lack of material. And I show this slide because there are boxes and boxes. You guys probably have never seen tape cassettes, and you certainly have never seen this, which is a reel-to-reel tape recorder that was used. Yeah, a laughing icon is exactly appropriate. So Chavez, one of the fascinating things about him is that as he created his own mythology in the interests of organizing, he also was a student of history, and he went to great lengths to preserve the history both of his own life and of the United Farm Workers, the union that he founded in the movement. And among other things, he taped many, many, many meetings, hours and hours, hundreds of hours of meetings of the internal workings of the organization and the executive board. And that was material that I drew on extensively in writing the book. And this is the actual tape recorder at Wayne State University in Detroit, which has a labor library that has all of the archives of the United Farm Workers. And I spent many hours sitting in front of this tape recorder, listening to tapes and transcribing them. So I'm going to do this as fast as I can, sort of tour through his life to just give a sense of, hopefully, a better sense of who he was and what he accomplished. These are the ruins of the house in Yuma, Arizona, where he was born and grew up until he was 12 years old. He grew up in a large extended family in his a house that was founded by his grandparents, and had a sort of kind of pleasant existence. I mean, certainly working class, but part of a real community in Yuma. This is the school that he went to from in grade school. And then when he was 12 years old, he was born in 1927, and when he was 12 years old in 1939, his family lost the land in a foreclosure, and they joined the migrant. They packed everything into their car and went to California and joined the migrant stream. This is the same year, just for sort of to put it in perspective, this is the year that The Grapes of Wrath was published, and it was very much for the following years of his life were very much the existence of a migrant farm worker, similar to what Steinbeck describes. He went to school through 8th grade. This is his 8th grade graduation picture. And like the overwhelming majority of Mexican American kids at that point, he left school partly because it was a racist system in most places that didn't believe that there was reason for Mexican American kids to go to school beyond 8th grade, and also because he needed to help his family and went to work in the fields with them. This is a photo of farm workers using a short-handled hoe. I don't know if people have heard of that. It was, you can see exactly what it was, and you can see why it required people to work bent over all of the time. And it was both, I mean, I show this picture as an example of the ways in which the lives of migrant farm workers were both physically brutal and punishing, and also the short-handled hoe was sort of this instrument and symbol of oppression, because a grower could look down the row and see, like, if anyone stood up to straighten up, to take a break, to relieve themselves, their back, you could see that person and order them back to work. And so it became this real symbol of oppression. And ultimately in 1975, California banned the short-handled hoe. So I won't dwell on this, but there's a lot about the lives of farm workers at that time that obviously shaped the rest of his life and his passions and his fights. And farm workers and domestic workers were and still are the only categories of workers who are excluded from all the protections of the National Labor Relations Act. That was because they were Black and brown people, largely at that point in time in the 30s when the laws were passed. So at this point in time, when he's working in the fields, none of the labor, health, any of the sort of standard protections for other kinds of workers apply to farm workers. They could be fired for any cause. There were no work breaks. There was nothing to protect them at all. And that, obviously really shapes his passion for doing something later on. He does get out of the fields. He goes into the Navy. He comes back, and by 1952, he had worked his way out of farm work, was living in San Jose, working with his brother at a lumber yard, and meets a man named Fred Ross, who's in this picture, who was a really legendary community activist who was largely responsible for founding something called the Community Service Organization, which was sort of the first grassroots organization for Mexican Americans in California. And they meet in 1952, and Ross immediately sees in Chavez the potential of someone who could be a brilliant organizer. And Chavez sees in Ross, for the first time, someone who can help, who can teach him, and who has demonstrated the power of community organizing and the things that people collectively can do, even poor people, in order to improve their situations in life, and is very attracted by this. And that sort of sets in motion really a 10-year, he works for 10 years for what I call a 10-year apprenticeship in community organizing. He works for 10 years for the Community Service Organization, traveling all around California, doing things like, this is a photo from San Jose, where he was the first vice president. They do voter registration drives. This is an example from Oxnard, California, which is one of the first places he organized farm workers. They do citizenship classes. He kept journals, diaries of all of his activities during that period of time. And reading them, you really see how he learned to organize, how he took people places, how he fought against what was then the guest worker program, the Bracero program. And it was really all of the training that led him to be able to do what he later does with the Farm Worker Union. So by 1962, he had in some ways outgrown the CSO. The CSO had turned into more of an organization that he felt had middle-class values, and he decides to do, what I think is this sort of incredibly brave thing, which is to walk away from a fairly well-paying job that he had with 8 children and moved with his wife and family to Delano, California, which is the center of the table grape industry, in order to try to form a union of farm workers. He's a man who almost never took vacations. And when he wrote, I read something where he wrote that he had taken a vacation before he moved to Delano. And I was kind of like surprised by that. And then in the archive, I found this photo. It's just one of a series of photos where his wife, Helen, had written on the back, she dated it April 1962, and the beach that they were on. So this was really his last break. In some ways, one could say for the rest of his life. Um, so he moved to Delano. He did not even want to call what he was doing a union because the concept of a union was so scary for people. I mean, the risk when you have absolutely no protection of joining a union. So he said that he was forming this thing called the Farm Workers Association. And this is a copy of the actual, he went around to all these little towns that farm workers lived in, handing out these cards and asking only these 2 questions. What do you think you should be paid? And would you be interested in a newspaper for farm workers? And I just want to pause on that for a minute because I think it's such a great example of his strategic brilliance and vision that he could envision that a newspaper for farm workers, many of whom didn't speak English or read English, and many of them had very little education, that a newspaper would be a vehicle for reaching people and doing community organizing, which it ultimately was. They had a newspaper for many years. And now I'm going back in time for a second. This is a photo of Chavez when he was in the Navy. And the reason I have it here is because he served in the Navy from 1946 to 1948. But as he begins to organize and to build up sort of his resume and his credentials and try to convince people to pay dues and to join this organization, he says that he joined the Navy in 1944 and served from 44 to 46. In other words, he backdated his Navy service 2 years. And the reason he did that because it allowed him to say he was a veteran. And that was sort of, he was, anything that he could do to sort of help convince people that they should buy into his vision and believe that this organization could deliver for him. They did. He did. So he moves there in April, and by September of 1962, he's organized enough people to hold the first convention of the Farm Worker Association, and which is what becomes what we know as the UFW, the United Farm Workers. You can see that "Viva la Causa," which some of you may know is still a big motto of the UFW, is adopted at the very first convention in 1962, as is the flag and the Black Eagle, which becomes so well known. So he's slowly building this organization, again not calling it a union, when in the fall of 1965, the Filipino Union, which was part of just AWOC in this picture, which stood for Agricultural Workers Organization, was an AFL-CIO local, went out on strike. It was a overwhelmingly Filipino union, and in the grape fields, the Mexicans were the pickers and the Filipinos were the packers, and they walked out on strike to try to get their wages from $1.25 an hour to $1.40. And the leader of the Filipino Union, who is over on the left here, Larry Itlian, went to Chavez and said, asked him to join the strike and to bring his organization out on strike and to call the farm workers. And Chavez didn't feel like the union was really ready for a strike, but recognized that, if he didn't do it, there would be no strike, and that this was an opportunity. So he joins the strike. There's a famous meeting on Mexican Independence Day in the Church of Our Lady of Guadalupe, where they vote to go out on strike. And the labor community is enormously important not only in the early years of the strike, but ongoing. The man in the center of this photo is Walter Reuther. Some of you may know about Reuther. More people should know about Reuther. He was the leader of the United Auto Workers. Actually, he's been in the news a little bit lately in this sort of with the new resurgent leadership of the UAW. There have been comparisons to Reuther. And so the support of organized labor is enormously important as the strike starts. Very hard to conduct a strike in fields to begin with, and even harder at the point in time that they were doing it in 1965, when the growers, this was not just an economic strike, it was really a strike that sort of was at the heart of the way of life and doing business in these communities. The growers controlled everything. They controlled the courts, they controlled City Hall, they even controlled the churches. The Catholic Church, which later on is very supportive of the farm workers, was not initially, because the financial pillars of the church in these communities were the growers. And so this is a photo that is a shrine that Cesar's brother Richard Chavez built into the back of their car, and they parked it outside the fields because the growers got an injunction that banned them from picketing essentially within a certain distance from the fields. But so what they did is they set this up instead, and they said, you can't ban us from praying in the street, right? So it was a way that they got around the injunctions. And there were just many, many examples of that, of sort of these clever ways. This is probably the most iconic photo of Cesar Chavez. In one of the things that he did that people do associate with him, I think, are these lengthy fasts, which he modeled in some sense after Gandhi. And he did them, the first fast rather, in 1968, as the strike was really lagging. It was enormously difficult to really stop production of grapes. If you think about the fact of, how you even find, it's not like there's a factory with an entrance that you can pick it in front of, or a store. There are people who are in fields, you don't even know where they are. So in order to sort of up the ante here, he did a 25-day fast. And Robert Kennedy, who was about 3 days later to announce that he was running for president, came to Delano and broke the fast with him. And this was really something that put both Chavez and the farm worker movement much more on the national map. And by July of 1969, he was on the cover of Time magazine. And just stop for a second to think about the fact that between 1962, when there is nothing and he moves to Delano, to July of 1969, this man who no one had heard of, even in California, ended up on the cover of Time magazine. A lot of that and a lot of the national publicity and a lot of the things people still remember about Cesar Chavez have to do with the boycott. The boycott was, again, a really sort of brilliant organizing tool, and it was an example of what he calls organizational jujitsu, which is taking the strength of the opponent and using it against them. So because farm workers were exempt from all the protections of the National Labor Relations Act, they also were able to do things that other unions were not. And so a secondary boycott, in which you boycott not only grapes, but stores that sell grapes, other unions cannot do that, but the farm workers could. And the way that they ultimately win the strike is not by stopping the production of grapes, and not even so much by stopping people from buying grapes, although they do some of that, but by being such incredible nuisances to the supermarkets. And this is a photo, this is the sort of thing they would do, which is do sit-ins in stores and have priests come and pray over the grapes, and they would load up shopping carts with like tons of frozen goods and then go to the counter and say, oh, you sell grapes, we can't shop here, and sort of throw a fit and leave the carts. And because they became, as one of their best organizers used to say, pests. And the supermarkets, many of whom had their own labor contracts and unions, ultimately went back to the growers, to the grape growers, and said, grapes are a luxury item. We don't have to carry them, solve this, because we don't want to go through this, or we're going to stop carrying grapes. And so in July of 1970, this remarkable accomplishment, this picture of Chavez and John Jamara, who was the leader of the grape growers. They signed contracts with the help of the Catholic Church clergy for about 150 different farms. I mean, virtually all of the grape growers in California. In many ways, this was probably the height of the membership. And it brought on a whole different set of challenges. They had suddenly had to make this pivot from being a movement and doing things like the boycott and all of those sorts of organizing tactics to suddenly being a traditional labor union that had contracts, that had to operate those contracts, that had hiring halls and so forth. Whole set of logistical challenges that pointed out. At the same time, there were all sorts of other farm workers in different fields who suddenly wanted the union, and they uh, um, pivoted to lettuce in the Salinas Valley. Chavez went to jail for this is a photo of Dolores Huerta and Ethel Kennedy coming from visiting him when he was in the Salinas jail at the end of 1970. So um, and I don't want to skip around too much, but I want to sort of get through everything and give a sense of the fact that they're both trying to manage these contracts, which they've never done before. And then they're also trying to move into an entirely different region of the state, a different crop, a different set of workers, a different set of growers, and organize in lettuce. At the same time, the Teamsters Union is gotten involved at basically has signed sweetheart contracts with a lot of the growers. There in 1973, there's essentially a sort of a labor war in the fields between the Teamsters and the UFW. The growers end up not renewing those contracts. There's an enormous amount of strife. There are several workers who are killed. The union is back to not having any contracts. And Chavez, in the organized labor movement in the FL-CIO, in exchange for supporting the strike in 1973 and supporting the UFW against the Teamsters, elicits from him a commitment to try to work for a labor law in California. Chavez doesn't want this. He doesn't want to be playing by the same kinds of rules that other unions are. He always said that he was happiest and being what he called the nonviolent Viet Cong. In other words, sort of a guerrilla war where he could set the rules. But by 1975, there's a set of factors that come together, both all of the problems in the fields and the strife and the labor who has been supporting the UFW sort of saying, we just can't, we want peace in the fields, essentially. And Jerry Brown, who who's both the youngest and the oldest governor that we had in California. Here he is in 1975, shortly after he was elected governor. He knew Chavez. He had supported the UFW. He was really interested in the plight of farm workers. And he sort of used all of the political skill that he had really and his political capital when he came into office in 1975 to negotiate a landmark bill called the California Agriculture Labor Relations Act. Until fairly recently, California was the only state that had a law that governed union activity in the fields. Farm workers have protected union rights. It was an extremely favorable labor law. It set up elections in the fields. It set up a process for elections within 7 days of filing, and there were all sorts of ways in which it was very favorable to the union. Although, of course, the growers also still had enormous power and fought hard against it. But all of a sudden, the law went into effect in the fall of 1975, and there were hundreds of elections between September of 75 and February of 1976. And literally people lining up, often to vote for the first time in their lives, often people who had not been able to vote, were not citizens, were not able to vote in regular elections, being able to vote for the union of their choice. And what this meant was that the UFW, which won a lot of these elections, again, in a way, was in a situation comparable to 1973, where they had all of these contracts to, when you win an election, you have to negotiate a contract. And when you negotiate a contract, you have to administer that contract. And you have to have a grievance committee. And you have to do all of these things that did not interest Cesar Chavez. He makes very clear in these tape recordings, once the law passes, and he even talks about knowing as soon as the law passed that this was going to change the nature of his movement, and thinking then about what he could do to preserve what was important to him, which was the movement part of it. So you have these agonized conversations at the executive board meetings after the law passes about, are we a union or are we a movement? We can't be both. And Chavez then sort of says, often says, well, you know, that's okay. You can all go and be a union, and I'll go off and I'll leave and I'll do something else. And he knew, as did everyone else, that that was just not conceivable. I mean, this was his union, it was his creation. And for people also who had followed him, it was really inconceivable to them in a real sense that he didn't know. I mean, they trusted him so much. He got us this far. How could he not know what he's doing? And yet, essentially, the union never makes the pivot into being I don't want to say a traditional union. It does not make the pivot into being a functioning labor organization that has, that could be sustained. Um, and at the same time that all this is going on, well, actually back in 1971, Chavez moves the headquarters of the union out of Delano, which is the center of the agricultural area, to this former tuberculosis sanatorium, which is now the National Chavez Center. It's in, I don't know if anybody knows California geography, but it's in the Tehachapi Mountains. It's very isolated. Now let's stay on that one. It's a place where he wanted to build a community. It's a place where people lived. I haven't even mentioned that. I should have mentioned that one of the ways that he formed the union and attracted people was that it was essentially or ostensibly an all volunteer community where people worked for room and board and $5 a week. And La Paz was a place where at some points up to 200 people lived in very not sort of rundown, ramshackle dorm type facilities. But it was part of his goal to build a community, and that was what was important to him. And this becomes at odds with the idea of having a functioning labor union. So you begin to get situations where people are quitting because they're getting older. They don't want to work for $5 a week anymore. And the growers never know. If you're having a negotiating session, sometimes the negotiator doesn't show up the next week because they're not there anymore. And there was that lack of continuity. And there was sort of this question of how were they going to make this transition. He becomes, in some ways, a larger than life figure. This is a poster from one of the clinics. I mean, he's trying to also, the union is sort of stretched in so many ways that it's beginning to fall apart. They're trying to operate health clinics. They have a pension plan. And at the same time, there's still more workers who want to be organized and are sort of demanding attention. And this is a photo from 1970, from his birthday, which is March 31st, Cesar Chavez Day now. And on March 31st, 1977, the union put out a memo saying that from now on, this would be known as Founders Day. And there were a lot of directions about what you should do on Founders Day to celebrate it appropriately. And I throw this in sort of just to, again, give you a little bit of a sense of the way in which it became, in some ways, as some people would later say, almost a cult. And this is his wife, Helen, next to him on one side, and his mother on the other. Things, again, sort of the wheels are coming off the train a little bit here. The Filipino farm workers are very disillusioned with the union, many of them. And Chavez does this thing that really backfires, where he goes to the Philippines as the guest of Ferdinand Marcos. Marcos was already sort of well known for his brutal tactics and dictatorship. And the religious community, which is a big supporter of Chavez, is very upset by this. he also forms an alliance with Synanon, which was sort of a drug treatment program that had turned into a cult, and begins to play the game, which is a sort of uh, an exercise that was developed for addicts in which people rat each other out and scream at each other and hurl obscenities. And there are tapes of them playing the game. Many of his most talented and committed organizers who really wanted to turn this into a union are either forced out and purged. There are a lot of purges. People become accused of being communists. And by the mid 1980s, the union has really lost most of its contracts. They don't have very many members. He holds his final fast in 1988. And this is a photo from that. And by then, his importance in many ways, again, in the field is diminished. But on the other hand, in the cities and on college campuses where he spends a lot of time during the last years of his life, he is enormously influential and welcomed. And he gives a speech at the Commonwealth Club of California in 1984, 1985, I think it's 1984. And it is in some ways, I open my book with this speech actually, because in some ways it's a eulogy for his own movement and union. But what he says is that no matter what happens in the fields, because at that point they have very few contracts, it doesn't matter, because what they have shown that the farm workers can do, and by demonstrating how the poorest people can, by banding together, take on what was the most powerful industry in California and succeed, that story and that example is now, will now be replicated in the cities and all over and be an inspiration. And it very much was. And his legacy in many ways is not in the fields, but is in the cities. And is a generation of people who were trained and who came out of the movement. I kind of, in trying to get through all of this and leave time for questions, I haven't talked that much about as Alex mentioned, the title of my first book was The Union of Their Dreams, which I was very proud of because it was sort of a play on both the union as in labor union, but also very much the people who came together, who had this dream, and who by uniting were able to achieve something that people had thought was really impossible. And the way in which he attracted that sort of combination of people from all walks of lives, those people whose lives were transformed by it, and who were the people who originally drew me into this subject, because as I met people who had come out of that movement, who talked about the way that their lives were absolutely transformed, and every person I've talked to who worked for the UFW in the 60s and the early 70s will say, I would not be doing what I'm doing today, but for having worked for the UFW. And many of them, probably most of them, left under less than ideal circumstances. And yet they're all like, I would do it again. And I think that story and that piece of his history is really important to understand, how he generated that. And then also to learn from the missteps and from the failure to form a sustainable union for farm workers. There were lots of forces that were arrayed against the farm worker union, just as there were against other labor unions. There were Republican administrations that came into power. There were changes in immigration. There were all sorts of things. But at its heart, the UFW was its strongest when Ronald Reagan was the governor of California and Richard Nixon was the president of the United States. So I think you can't just blame the political forces for the decline. There were other things about what made it difficult. And I also think the lessons are worth studying to see, sort of for anyone who is engaged in social justice in any way, the and particularly the issues that I think I talk about in my first book, The Union of Their Dreams, are sort of, how do you have a democracy and still get things done? What are the times, what are the points at which you feel that you should speak up? Many people feel, well, if only we had said X, Y, or Z, maybe things could have turned out differently. Should I have done this? There are people who went on to do lots of other things in the labor movement who made different decisions and later in their lives because of what they experienced in the farm worker movement. So, and the last thing I'll say is, I end with this photo because to me, again, it's Chavez at his sort of most human. He loved being in La Paz. Those are his two dogs, Boycott and Welga, whom he was very attached to. They are buried there with him, or next to him. And the word hero is derived from the Greek. It comes from the Greek word for hero, and in Greek mythology, heroes were the offspring of a mortal and a god. And from their god parent, they inherited their sort of superhuman powers. And from their mortal parent, they inherited their human flaws. And if you think of Achilles' heel as being, he was that was his fatal flaw. And so I think it's also important to think about our heroes as being human and being complicated and having flaws too, and the fact that their flaws do not detract from their heroic accomplishments or legacies. And it's worthwhile to think about people and understand them in all of their complexity. And I will stop there and take questions.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for that presentation. Let's get another round of digital applause. This will be your second round of digital.
All
Uh,
right.
Absolutely fantastic. I mean, the work itself is amazing, and I think the presentation did an excellent job of kind of teasing out some of these contradictions and complications surrounding this figure, who I think in your closing moments, you mentioned kind of like the burden of the type of sort of celebrity and fame that he experienced, especially for someone who had you know, early on, it seems like throughout his life, had a sense of himself as a consequential historical figure. I didn't know that about sort of
Mhm.
his post dating, his military service, to sort of add sort of one more accolade to his long list of accomplishments. Um, we we had some great questions that came in about this idea of Chavez and just sort of his his vision for the working class or working people. His sense of himself as a historical figure, how some of his goals surrounding, or I guess his reticence to embrace sort of middle class politics,
Mhm.
eventually sort of you know uh, ostracized some of his union members who were very much interested in sort of bread and butter issues. It seems like he had obviously had a real sense of the difference he was making. But he also had a sense of like how what he was doing was going to be perceived historically. And I'm kind of curious, and this came out of, again, a couple different questions that I'm kind of synthesizing. Just were there instances where you could sense that this awareness of his identity as a historical persona was affecting his decision making in one direction or another?
Hmm. Um, okay, let me think about that for a second, but a couple thoughts on the rest of what you said. But I'm glad you made that point about the sort of his sense of himself as a historical figure, because I think that's really important. And the archive is amazing because he saved everything and he directed people to save everything beginning in 1969. And the fact that he kept these tapes and kept many documents that actually contradicted things he was saying in public at the time, to me, um, was an affirmation of the idea that he understood as a student of history. And he was I mean, I didn't get to this part, but he was an autodidact. I mean, he was very well read and very well educated, self-educated, um, and I think he understood that his place in history ultimately was going to depend on these documents and to the real telling of the story, and that the mythology that he created, and like that example of backdating his Navy service, which by the way is like, I think it's still in books and curriculum and things like that. I mean, it's been corrected since the Navy actually named a ship after him, um, and at that point they, that they had the correct dates, but that once he was gone, that mythology didn't matter anymore, right? I mean, to me, he did things, um, that he felt were going to help his cause. And one can argue about what his cause was exactly, or whether whether you agree with the direction he was going. But they were very much, not just gratuitously embellishing things, but very directed towards organizing. So I do think, and I mean, on the tapes, for example, some of the lawyers would say, I hope we're destroying these tapes, because they knew they were being recorded, and he would say, oh yeah, it's just to do the minutes of the meeting and then we record over them, which wasn't true. Like he knew they were saving them all. So clearly he was saving those for history and because of his sense of history. Um, I do think the other, the other point you made about the middle class, he would talk about middle class holes. That was sort of a, and people who wanted to have a color television set. That was like really, an enormous insult. Basically, he was very upset actually when his one of his grandsons became a golfer. Was like a pro golf. It was very, and the idea of him playing golf was, that was not good. Um, and so there was this very strong conflict between the idea of having a union leader representing members who want to make more money, who believes that they shouldn't want to make that much more money, right? That they should have a decent life and be respected and all of those things, but that they should not aspire to make too much money. They should aspire to shared sacrifice, and that we have to educate people to this. And that, ultimately obviously came in conflict. And a lot of his conflicts about immigration and immigrants stem from that belief also, because immigrants want to make more money, and that's what they were working to make money, and that, was not a value he shared.
Well, and he was a workaholic. I mean, it seems like he. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I really enjoyed the two pictures: the picture of him with his family at the beach, and then the picture of him with the dogs. Because I feel like, to the extent that we know Chavez as a figure, I mean, it comes out exclusively through his work, and it's just this. It's um, part of union negotiating often revolves around the idea of, the opportunity to stop working, right? And so like the idea
Right.
that he just was working his entire life is kind of, it seems like it almost runs at odds against some of the things maybe his union was interested in. I was curious too, and we had a question submitted about kind of the role of Chavez as a mentor. Like he seems like somebody who um, cultivated this cult of personality. But I was curious to know more about sort of how he it seemed like he was reluctant to sort of cede much authority to anyone, even in instances where he was less than interested in sort of like enforcing contracts, things like that. There's that the scene where he fires sort of all his attorneys to save money and then winds up spending more money a couple of years later. Um,
Right.
so I was curious to know just kind of like in his style of leadership, was, I don't want to say like self-absorbed, but was he actively beyond organizing, was he sort of training up leaders beneath him, or was he sort of so paranoid about his status that he saw any other kind of like leader as a threat?
I mean, I think unfortunately the latter is certainly true. Um, I think that, and there are many people who viewed him, as a mentor, and particularly in the earlier years, and for whom he was a mentor, and from whom they learned a lot. But he was a control freak, and he did not was not willing to delegate. And he talked about the union, negotiating contracts and administering contracts as being, the mundane work, and that did not interest him. But he was not willing to have someone else take that over. And even there's a scene at the first convention of the United Farm Workers when they become an AFL-CIO um, organization, um, which is in 1973. He sort of says something to a guy who's writing a book, a biography of him, that to the effect, I don't remember the exact words, but now it begins basically, and now people will try to come after me. And clearly had a sense that he didn't trust people who might be his successors, and that became a big problem. So I just want to say, I mean, I'm trying to phrase this in a way that he was a mentor to people in some ways, again, especially in the earlier years where people felt, and in some ways those people later felt very betrayed, some of them who felt they had a relationship with him where he was a mentor figure for them, and then he push them out, kind of. So there are ways in which he was, but in terms of actually ceding control, he was, or grooming people who could take over and do things. He was certainly not willing to do that.
Nice. And can you talk a little bit about his relationship with Dolores Huerta? As somebody who, again, another complicated, complex figure, but also as someone who eventually sort of got nudged out of the UFW.
She did, although I'm sure she would not agree with that characterization. um, uh, their relationship is complicated. They met through Fred Ross, working for the Community Service Organization. And um, so Chavez used the word fanatics in a very positive sense, because as you said, he believed in, not ever taking vacations and working and being absolutely fanatically committed to the boycott or to whatever it was that your assignment was. So to be a fanatic was high praise. There were very few people. And Dolores was as fanatical as he was, in the sense that if he asked her to do something, she would just drop it. She had 11 kids. They, whatever he needed something, she went there. And so she matched him in that. And I think he recognized that and appreciated that quality. The two of them fought all the time on these tapes. There are just screaming matches between them that are like painful to listen to even now. So they had a very tempestuous relationship in some ways as well. She was never married to, but partnered with for many, many years, Chavez's brother, Richard, who was also on the executive board. And so there was sort of all kinds of complicated family dynamics as well. Um, and Dolores Huerta is going strong at 93 or something like that, right? And has created her own mythology and is using that to try to do more organizing. So more power to her.
Excellent. And I've been told long before my time at UWT, Dolores Huerta actually came to campus and talked, I think back in the early
She
aughts.
goes everywhere. She still goes. She's quite remarkable in her strength and vigor.
Yeah, she and James Lawson, I think, are like exactly the same age, and they're both still just like, just absolute forces of nature. Um, we had, and again, I'd invite anybody on the call. If you have questions, feel free to just throw them in the chat. I've got more that the students submitted, and somebody actually back channeled me about a question. I was wondering, what is the extent of the influence the UFW exerts today in terms of improving conditions for farm workers?
Um, that's a really long, complicated answer that probably we don't have time to get into, but they're not, their membership is very, very small. It was, I think there was a recent study from UC Merced that said that the percentage of farm workers who were unionized in California was statistically insignificant. Um, they have become, sort of focused as they did in Chavez's later years, much more as a political force. Their gains have been through legislation largely, and essentially they stopped organizing in the 1980s and never really started again. They have, I mean, they were able to win a card check law in California last year, which, unions have been salivating over everywhere for a long time. It remains to be seen whether they will use that card check law or how they'll use it, or whether they're really recommitting to organizing, as they say. But essentially, they're much more a political force than they are in the fields.
And I think your presentation did a really, oh, there we go.
Oh, there's Michael Honey's flag.
Nice. And I saw Mike mention that she was here when we used to have meetings in the old ILWU hall. I was actually thinking, I see Mike's, you got the flag there. A quote from Mike's book about one of the ones that I always think about when I think about King is like, how we remember King matters. This idea of like, how we sort of choose to historicize these figures matters. And I'm kind of curious to know, the two-dimensional version of Chavez that you feel like has been, gradually incorporated into standard curriculum. I feel like most students I have who've taken an AP class have sort of heard of Chavez, but
Right.
they don't sort of know all the contours. What do you think? Like, I mean, for me, just panning back, like, not learning about King as a sort of, an economic justice radical, right? The idea of the Poor People's Campaign, like that chapter being left out of the traditional King story in the K through 12 education. Um, what do we miss out on when we don't get the full story of Chavez, when we get sort of that
Right.
two-dimensional
And
version?
when we get like the movie. So
Yeah.
let me try to answer that, and also Maya's question in the Zoom, because I think they combine in some ways. That he was at his best in small groups, and he was in, I mean, there are two things that he was really good at, and what I think we lose um, from the two-dimensional view is understanding that, like, what was his power as an organizer and why was he able to do this. And part of it was how good he was one-on-one, and sort of goes to Maya's question in the sense that, people, he was really power, he was very soft spoken, he wasn't a great speaker in any way. um, but there are all of these people who will talk about their interactions with him and their history with the union, and they'll be like, and then Caesar asked me to, whatever, get on a plane and leave my family and go across the country and stop the sale of grapes. And I was like, okay. And so he was, it's this sort of magnetic, really charismatic appeal that helped him in terms of his one-on-one organizing. And that, coupled with the strategic brilliance, right, of how he put together these coalitions, how he figured out the boycott. I mean, there's lots more examples that I could give that also, again, um, gave him this power, that coupled with his willingness to physically sacrifice himself with the fasts and the marches and going to jail and things like that, made him such an inspirational figure that people were willing to follow. And he was able to deliver victories in ways that for a while, for a long time, in ways that therefore gave people something to believe in, and that gave him and added power as organizing. And so I think we miss all of that. Like the movie, it's sort of Caesar by himself dumping grapes into the river and that kind of thing. And it's like, that does him a disservice, because it wasn't that he did this himself. He understood from the beginning the need to go outside of Delano and outside of the areas that were controlled by the growers, and to get forces from, from the outside, from the student movement, from the civil rights movement, from the churches, from the labor movement, to come in and do those things. And so that, I think that's what we miss, is sort of in the he organized farm workers and they went on strike and they got contracts, and in losing, in the simplified version of the story.
Well, and through the boycott, I mean, he captured the attention of a nation. And it reminds me, I think it's in, well, you mentioned Alinsky, I think, in your presentation, or it's definitely in the Union of Their Dreams, like this idea of an organizational strategy that's sort of like top down. And I know Jane McAlevy's had like issues with New Labor and their approach to
Right.
sort of, and it seems like in the fields, like it is, I mean, for all the reasons you mentioned, like it's just difficult to physically strike out there in a way that's like publicly, you know, motivating or inspiring. Um, but I think you also mentioned in your book that like the boycott also didn't necessarily make the farm workers themselves ready to become rank and file union members, right? Like it's like this sort of like weird relationship where all of a sudden, all of these workers were now unionized, but they weren't necessarily um, ready to become organizers, right? Ready to sort of perpetuate their own union. I just wonder if you had any. I was surprised to see Alinsky. I was reading that McAlevey book recently, and thinking about this, like top down versus bottom up organizing. And it seems like Chavez needed to organize in the way he organized because of the conditions of sort of the fields of California. But it also made for kind of challenges in the long term, right?
Well, I think he lost sight. I think that, in the beginning, where he's going around to these communities and asking people to sign these cards, he understood that he needed people to sort of buy, you need for hope to overcome fear, right? That's the organizer's line. I mean, he needed to give people a reason to believe in something that was kind of scary and kind of risky for them, right? And he understood that that functioned on two levels. It functioned on a transactional level. So when he asked people to pay $3.50 a month in dues early on for his first organization, he needed to give them something in return for that. And what he was able to do was negotiate a death benefit so that they had insurance to, because we didn't have GoFundMe's yet, so people needed to have money to bury and pay for the funerals of their loved ones. Um, and so he understood that, and then he also understood that he needed to sort of give them something to believe in that was La Causa, right? And it functioned on both levels. And then as he becomes more and more frustrated with the time-consuming mechanics of operating the labor union, because as you say, like when he gets the contracts in 1970, suddenly all these workers are union members and they didn't vote for the union. They don't really know what's going on. So then the union is operating labor halls, which in theory is great and is going to, help to prevent favoritism. But what about all the people, the Filipinos who would work in one crew with their families, and now they show up and they can't do that anymore? And the logistical nightmares where were sort of overwhelming, and again sort of didn't interest him. And so he, I think, moves further and further away from that, which again, at his core and at his strength, and the people who learned from him understood that need to give people some reason to believe in something. And I think, that we see that all over the labor movement, and lots of unions that have moved away from, I mean, there are people who argue that the Janus decision was a good, useful thing for the labor movement, in that it made unions have to go back and actually convince members that they should join, and that there was a reason to join, and sort of not take that for granted. I just wanted to quick comment on one of the comments in the Zoom, because it's really good, which has to do with the equitable, the EFI. That's a good link to a report that just came out that goes to some of the problems also that the UFW was sort of, exchanged or gained money basically for lending its name to certifying farms as being equitable, which is very sort of problematic. Anybody who's really interested in seeing sort of what I think of as probably the best farm worker organizing going on now should look at the coalition for the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Florida, which is not a labor union, but is a different model and has done some really interesting things. And there's also a good small union in Washington State that is, okay, I'm sorry, my geography is really bad. Is it anywhere near you? Familias por la Justicia?
I'm pretty sure that's eastern half of the state.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I was going to say, I know we had David Bacon was up here
Uh-huh.
sharing his work, and we had some organizer, yeah, Yakima into the north. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
they've done really well. They were on the Driscoll's boycott for many years and really struggled for a long time on strike, and then were able to form an independent union. Um, they've had their clashes with the UFW as well over a lot of issues. And the UFW right now is sort of decided that guest workers are the future and that's so they're essentially focused on the H2 program and which is very problematic for lots of other people in the labor movement.
nice, excellent. I'm just scrolling through the chat here. We did have a question submitted by a student just about the role of Chavez's faith in his organizing, but also then just sort of the role of the church within
Mm-hmm.
the movement itself is something that seems, decidedly kind of absent from today's labor movement. Like coming
True.
out of the civil rights movement, how many of these movements were really sort of facilitated through the church?
The church and religious organizations, so not just the Catholic Church, but in fact, early on, the Protestant churches were far more important and supportive. The National Farm Worker Ministry became really sort of an adjunct of the UFW for a long time, and was really important in again in at that time a largely Mexican Catholic workforce, and to see that you had powerful people like bishops supporting was a big deal. And also in terms of organizing boycotts and sort of the boycott, which many people of a certain age is still that's what they associate with the UFW. Like, is it okay to eat grapes now? The boycott, again, a sort of brilliant example of his organizing, and his organizing at a time, to get back to Maya's point, where he couldn't control what was going on in all of these cities. I mean, remember, we barely had fax machines at that time, so it's not like there was sort of the instant communication that there is now. So he sends out farm workers, many of them have never been on a plane, have never whatever, to cities around the country and in Canada with this mission of stop the sale of grapes. Like, here's a bunch of buttons to sell in the name of a labor person or a religious person who will pick you up at the airport and make sure you have a place to stay, and you figure out how to get to supermarkets in Chicago to stop selling grapes. And some of them did, and they did it by forming coalitions, and again, the religious and labor community and students being the three big pillars of that. But that became a training ground where a lot of people learned to be, the people who figured it out and also were smart organizers like Chavez had been, they rose up and, then they had to leave. But the boycott, the religious community was really important in the boycott and in supporting the boycotters who get sent out to all these places around the country.
Excellent. We've probably got time for one or two more. If people in the chat have questions, again, feel free to pose them. Um, I think that this story, for me is one that can't be told without including the Teamster portion, right? And the
Right.
way that sort of organized labor, from an outsider's perspective, this is organized labor fighting sort of against itself on a national scale, along like fairly racialized lines. So I was curious if you could just talk a little bit more about kind of, the Teamsters role within,
Sure.
the battle, what is it, the Battle of Coachella, um,
Right.
but then
Right.
the
There's a famous piece that was written about, yeah, 1973. So essentially, after the contracts are signed in 1970, and as the UFW is about to move to organize in the vegetables, which is very different kind of workforce in vegetables than in grapes, and different geographically, and also a much more militant workforce because the people who worked, especially in lettuce, the lechugueros, who worked in trios, and they were mostly men, they were not families, and they were, so it's just a different dynamic. They were much more willing to, they were ready to go out on strike. They didn't need to be convinced. And the vegetable growers in the area of Salinas, wanting to preempt the UFW from coming in, sign contracts with the Teamsters, sign sweetheart contracts, so that they can say, we have union contracts. You can't boycott. We have union lettuce. We're with the Teamsters. And so that's the first place the Teamsters come in and play that role. Um, and the Teamsters, the story of the Teamsters over time is a little bit more mixed when you get to elect. Well, let me go chronologically. So that's the first battle. There are a lot of court fights, there are a lot of depositions, and so on. Then in 1973, when the first set of grape contracts expire, the grape growers say, "Oh, we can do this too. We'll sign with the Teamsters." Um, it becomes a little more complicated there in terms of the workers. The vegetable workers felt sold out, no question. They were with Chavez. They, were not supporting the Teamsters, but there wasn't a lot that they could do about it right away. Um, the grape workers, because of all the difficulties in administering the contracts and the people who had been inconvenienced and unhappy with the UFW's administration, there was actually sort of, some support for the Teamsters, which were much more a normal bread and butter union that, knew how to do these things, sort of. So it's a little more mixed in terms of, well, what do the workers really support? But certainly in terms of the public perception, there were these Teamsters, and they just brought in these like thugs to, in that picture, to menace the UFW supporters and the picketers and taunt them. And the UFW, absolutely won the PR war there. And again, the religious people were very important because they would come in there and they would certify to the world that the Teamsters were bullies and thugs and were picking on on the UFW. So that confrontation in 73, again, is what sort of helps to get the law. Now, once the law passes, the Teamsters begin to compete in elections and they win some elections. So those are more sort of legitimate, there's more competition. And then in 1977, they sign a non-compete. They sign an agreement with the Teamsters, exactly in essence, where the Teamsters agree to pull out of the fields. And there are people who were involved at the time who think that that was actually a mistake, that they should, had the Teamsters stayed and been a competitive force, it might have forced the UFW to pay more attention to those contracts and to, administering them and to being. So there is an argument that the competition with the Teamsters by the time, by the point at which there was a state structure in place, was in some ways healthy, but it wasn't to be. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I think like so many things connected to this history is that like it's very complicated, right? Depending on what sort of year you're looking at, things change dramatically. I think Union of Their Dreams does a really good job of like just sort of chronicling Chavez's pivot north to, a different group of agricultural workers. And just, you would think, well, it's California. They're both, these are people working in the fields, but it's just sort of a completely different context for organizing and a
Right.
completely different culture amongst the workers.
And
Is
one thing that, so I just want to, there's one thing that one sort of piece of this that I didn't mention. And since we're talking about the workers, I want to, because I think it's really important and it's sort of the end of Union of their dreams. And that again goes back to the lettuce workers who, um, who should have been the future leaders of the union and who believed that they were the future of the union because that's what Chavez said. We're going to turn the union over to the farm workers, right? And there's a strike in 1979, and out of that strike comes leadership um, in the vegetables and come contracts that have a provision that is modeled after the UAW and some other unions for a paid union representative. One of the battles within the UFW in the 70s is over whether farm workers, is over paying salaries in general. And in particular, how are you going to get farm workers to take leadership positions in the union if you don't pay them? Because that goes back to what we were talking about before of the tension between a union leader who doesn't think people should want to make so much money. And so his position was if they want to make money, we have contracts now, they can go make money. And then you had sort of the few farm workers who were in leadership positions saying, yeah, but they're not going to volunteer to be leaders in the union. We're not going to get the leadership. So then in 79, you get contracts that actually have paid representatives in them that pay farm workers, to be the union rep at various vegetable companies for the first time, and that becomes an enormous threat. And ultimately, he fires those people. And there's a long court battle in which they argue that he didn't have the right to fire them because they were elected. And years later, they win. But by that time, it's a moot question. And they are out of the fields. They were shunned. They were not able to work. And that, in many ways is for me, one of the most tragic parts of the story, because those are the people who could and should have been the next leadership core of the union.
Mhm. Well, we've got one question in the, or actually we got two questions in the chat
Oh
here.
dear.
All right, and maybe we'll wrap with these. So we've got Mike wants to know if there's a legacy of organization for farm workers in California today, or a benefit they enjoy from the state labor law. And then,
Well, that's an easy. I mean, the answer is that the labor law is stronger than it's ever been, but the UFW so far is really not using it. So, I mean, it's an incredibly strong law. They can be certified, even if they can be certified if they lose an election. If there's interference that's proven, the board can certify it. There's a mandatory mediation law so that they have to get a contract if they win an election. I mean, there's so much that is favorable and at this point there's not much going on, but the law is there certainly is a strong law that somebody could use at some point. What is the main reason to the I mean, this is Rachel's question. The union the question was whether where the emphasis of the you have this all volunteer union. It's difficult it's sort of an unwieldy as an administration. And the question was how to be a movement and a union, how to preserve the movement spirit while being a union. And because to him, the business of the union was really, as he said, mundane and didn't interest him, that made it okay. Sorry, my earbuds are dying, so I'm just hold on a second. I just have to take them out and I'll be offline.
oh, can't hear you.
Okay.
Oh, now we can hear you.
Okay, sorry about that. The the he had to make decisions about where to assign staff. Do you assign staff to negotiate and to administer contracts, or do you assign staff to, try to figure out programs to be a poor people's union? And if you are going to have negotiators, who are they going to be, and how do you keep them? And again, coming back really also to this question of, who are they going to be, the people who run the union, and is it going to be farm workers, and are you going to have locals, which they never did. So he's the one who begins to define this as we're a movement or a union, but we can't be both, and he sees that as a problem. I'm not sure if I'm clarifying that enough.
Well, and it's a really different skill set. I mean, some people are competent both in organizing and managing a union, but I mean, those are two discrete sets of skills, and it's not, it's perfectly normal to be good at one thing and less interested in another thing,
And
especially with that personality, right?
right, and there's a long history there are lots of other figures, historical figures, who were the people who were able to build something and not necessarily the person best able to run it, but couldn't give it up because it was their creation. And so he's not the only one to have been in that situation.
Okay, very last question, and this is actually one that I should have asked at the very beginning, and it's one I typically ask because a couple students submitted similar questions. People were just curious about what initially attracted you to this history. What drew you to the farm workers movement? And
Right. So I should say that I'm from New York. I moved to California in 2000, which is already a long time ago, I guess. Like probably, you guys were some people were not even born then, but to me, it's relatively recent. It still feels recent. But I came here and I was working at the Los Angeles Times, and I was an editor, and then I became a reporter, and I was sort of able to pick something that I wanted to focus on what we would call a beat, and um, just kind of got interested in agricultural policy. I mean, no one still covers agriculture, from a newspaper point of view, at least in California, um, as something that sort of, had so many different facets to it, as the intersection for me, the appeal is the intersection of policy and people. And there was all sorts of real policies that were having effect on real people. And I was interested in pesticides, and I began to look at that. And then I think about this a lot, actually. Someone told me there were farm workers living in this sort of canyons in San Diego, sort of in, just makeshift communities and canyons and, at that point in time, that was just sort of appalling. Now, we have homeless people who live in much worse conditions than the farm workers that I saw in San Diego. But at the time, that was like, you know, there was no water, there were no facilities, they were just sort of burrowed into canyons. So I began to cover agriculture as a beat, and being a baby boomer who knew about the Great Boycott and didn't know much about the UFW or Cesar Chavez, whom I never met. That's another question I get a lot. I was like, oh, I'll call the UFW and find out, what, because I thought that the UFW had sort of solved all these problems. And then as I began to ask people about the union, they said, oh, they're not a force in the fields at all. They're not there. So I thought that was really interesting. And I became interested in what had become of the UFW and why it wasn't a force in the fields, and why these conditions were still, as bad as they were. And so that developed into what became a 4-part series for the LA Times that I did about the current UFW, the current at that point in time, which was 2006. And how it had sort of become a lot of interlocking nonprofits that did other things, but were not, not a force in the fields. And I originally went to talk to some of the people who had been significant figures in the 60s and the 70s, just to, I thought, put in context what was going on now and understand, how we'd gotten to the present. And their stories about, became so compelling, and I became convinced that the events that we've sort of touched on of the late 70s and the early 80s
were so connected to what was going on in the present that I went to Wayne State and I started looking at archives. And one of the three parts of the series was just, and it was very unusual for a newspaper, it was just about what happened between 1977 and 1981. You know, how did the Union sort of fall apart as a force? And after that, I wanted to write a book about those people and about that because, you know, again, and like as I said, the sort of these people that I met who were so passionate and committed. I mean, I'd never met people who were so committed to a cause and who had thought that they would be doing this, you know, for the rest of their lives or for a significant part. Um, and I kind of came along at a good time, I think, when it was history enough, because, of course, another thing, particularly in the left, is you don't talk about your problems and you don't air your dirty linen in public. And so there were a lot of people who had never talked about what happened to them or to other people or, you know, the story. And they were sort of ready to talk about it. So that's what led me to write The Union of Their Dreams. And The Union of Their Dreams, you know, is not about Cesar Chavez. I mean, he's a central character, but he's not center stage. He's off stage or stage left or something. And it's really, I mean, it's a narrative history of 8 people, farm workers, students, lawyers, who joined the UFW during that period of time. And it's told from their perspectives, which really sort of hadn't been done. And then after I finished that, people said, well, why don't you write a biography of Cesar Chavez? Because there isn't one. And I resisted that for a while. And then, you know, and I mean, there were a lot of Chicano historians who knew all about Cesar Chavez and who knew about the archive, but did not want to be the person to write about it. And, you know, for a long time, I felt that way too. I didn't want to be the person to tarnish the legacy of the greatest living, you know, Latino figure. And then I really kind of partly became convinced by talking to historians that the lack of scholarship was, as I said earlier, was really a disservice and was really, you know, not partly responsible for why people didn't know who he was and didn't understand his legacy, and that it was too important what he had done to, you know, that it deserved that kind of treatment. So,
God, well, I mean, I don't think we could end it on a better note than that. Go out, check out these books. They're absolutely fantastic. Again, I'm just super honored to be able to host you here. I know we've been talking about this for like years, so I'm glad to finally get you on and celebrate this work. Which again, I think just like you said, it takes that two-dimensional understanding of this figure and really and add some life to it and add some complexity to it. And I think you know, at the end of the day, the portrait you wind up presenting is much more compelling and much more human, and I think much more inspiring. So, thank you again so much. One last round of digital applause for Miriam Pawel for joining us.